So it's lovely to be able to welcome Gareth McNab from CAP. I'll ask him to introduce himself in a minute. The focus of today's time is looking at how church unity movements, churches working together, can make a greater impact given the times we're in with the cost of living crisis, as we think about supporting people with money, debt and poverty issues. So Gareth, would you just introduce yourself firstly, and then give us some of your thoughts on what the issues are right now, and if you can, some thoughts on what churches can do better working together in this area of debt, money and poverty.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks everyone for having me. Apologies that I'm not Ellie Gage. She's our Chief of Engagement. She's an absolute powerhouse of a woman and would do lots of this better than I can. But she's otherwise engaged today with a trustee meeting, I'm afraid. So I'm Director of External Affairs. I look after our political and public policy engagement. I look after Christians Against Poverty's engagement with the organisations to whom our clients owe money, so the creditors and the FCA, the regulator of the banks and organisations like that. I also take a lead on our strategy to end UK poverty, which sounds big, and it really is. You will also find that I had a choice between Christmas music in Starbucks or Portuguese in Nando's. I chose the Portuguese because it's still a bit early for Christmas music in the background. So apologies, this was the best Wi-Fi connection I could find in the area. So I won't take too much time to tell stories because you're all plugged in to your local churches, to providing services in local communities, and there isn't really a story I can tell you that will be sadder or more emotive or more connecting than the last one you saw. But for credibility purposes, I was in a WhatsApp conversation yesterday with 3 people I met on Iona. I did a pilgrimage in the first week of July to the Iona community with some friends from Church Action on Poverty. That was, we were increasingly wanting to centre the voices of people who lived experience of poverty among those of us who campaign about it. It's a long time since my family last experienced poverty ourselves. And while I'm probably closer than many to the issues, I still don't experience them myself in my everyday life. During that week, it turned out, I didn't realise, not everyone there was a Christian. There were some participants on that pilgrimage who were part of other lived experience groups. But since then, they formed a WhatsApp group with me and Anthony, one of our clients from Christians Against Poverty. And they've stayed very active in sharing their story with people in power of all kinds of different persuasions. And I see in progress on digital poverty, on particularly services in Stoke, where 2 of them are from. And it was my delight to be able to let them know that I'll be in Stoke on Friday. I'm recording with UCB all morning. We've got a takeover at the radio station on Friday for some fundraising, and they want to come and meet me at the station. They want to come and have lunch with me there. That connection is very, very genuine, and they have loved the stories of hearing Kingdom Breakthrough. One of the people who went to the islands was baptized a couple of weeks ago, and those who remain not yet believers joined in the celebration on WhatsApp and zoomed in to watch the baptism. It was just a delight. And so even among anti-poverty work, the good news of Jesus is going forth. In terms of churches, where we're at right now, I think is a bit of a tipping point on the service provision model that CAP and other franchises, so to speak, have successfully pioneered and massively multiplied around the church. Is butting up against one of those issues that one of our colleagues on the call identified about volunteer recruitment and retention. And now in the middle of a cost of living crisis that is also a cost of giving crisis, we're beginning to realise that a lot of the services we want to provide in and through local communities are themselves relatively vulnerable. They're vulnerable to the headwinds of funding, of volunteers. They also are just exhausting, aren't they? Like, it's tiring work to be rolling up your sleeves every day of the week and going to battle against the powers and principalities and hand out food and give debt advice and do all of the great things that our churches are doing. And we don't mind because we work hard with all the energy God gives us, don't we? But it is still a slog. And as we begin to realize as Christians Against Poverty that we aren't simply a debt advice organization wanting to get people out of debt one at a time, but we are an anti-poverty organization wanting to end the need for our own service in a similar way as Trussell Trust and other anti-poverty movements are beginning to express themselves. We're realizing that with 14 million people in the UK in poverty, 1 in 5 of the population, it's going to take us a jolly long time and every single church in the country partnering with us for about 45 years before we make a dent in that number. And so we need to increasingly be seeking to influence those in power, both Westminster and central governments, but also local expressions of power, large anchor employers, all forms of power, to seek a reduction in inequality, just as Mark led us in prayer earlier. That poverty is bigger than the inability to feed your children or put them to sleep in a bed or the inability to find the next few meals. That is absolutely poverty. But poverty is everything that comes against the human being's dignity and agency and power of choice over their own life, which was granted us in the garden, deprived of us by our first father and mother through sin, and remains powerful in the earth today because of the repeated sin of humanity in choosing ourselves over our brother and sister's good. And so the meeting of needs in our immediate community is a really important thing to do. And we realize that all of our campaigning work as Christians Against Poverty is built upon the integrity of, I spoke to a client 2 days ago. A church in this place helped a family with some food vouchers last week. It's built on the actual integrity of, we are delivering services. We aren't only getting mouthy and shouting political slogans. We believe the scriptures, and that's why we're led by the Spirit to meet immediate needs, and we're led by the Spirit to speak truth to power. And I think the evolution of church at this time needs to be both a continued galvanizing of efforts to meet needs in our communities, this time in the face of difficulty. A lot of these franchise efforts spun up in Cameron's Big Society. The first version of austerity didn't necessarily hurt churches in large parts of the UK all that much in my reading and experience, in that the largely middle-class church, Natalie Williams' book, famously identifying that we're broadly at 80% middle class across the UK church, particularly the evangelical expression of it. The austerity movement certainly hurt some people on the fringes of our communities, but it didn't really touch the core of who we were. But this cost of living crisis is coming a lot further up the income curve than 2007-8 financial crisis did. And it's beginning to constrain our ability to meet needs. And so we are going to need to double down our efforts to meet needs in our communities, despite having needs within our own congregations and communities and needs of our own. But increasingly, I think this time round, we are going to need to learn how to raise our voice, to speak truth to power, to battle for unity within our congregations, and to yet still challenge anyone in power who exacerbates inequalities, who is participating with the powers and principalities in the world in keeping down humans, but especially the poor, the people that we care the most deeply about. And so we're learning a lot at the moment as Christians Against Poverty and how we galvanize this movement, how we work most effectively together with churches around all 4 parts of the UK, all 4 nations. And I think one of the challenges I've experienced as the guy on the hook for our political language and stuff is pastors don't like politics, or rather they don't like sounding political. And so we need to work together as leaders in an anti-poverty movement, but also people who gather groups of churches together. And you have learned something that I need. You have learned how to gather churches from all kinds of different backgrounds around a common cause of, this place matters to God, this place matters to the people God has placed here, and we're going to work together for the good of the place which we live. And so you found a way to bypass religious partisan language. I think I found some ways to begin to bypass political partisan language, to sound the alarm that poverty is evil and can and should be ended in our lifetimes, without necessarily directly criticizing a particular party's policies or promoting another party's policies. So we have to be able to find a way to preserve unity in our churches, unity between believers, who may disagree on the political solution to the problem, but need to agree with us that poverty is indeed a problem that can and should be solved. So let's work together to solve it. So that's a little bit of a walk through our service provision. It's really needed. There is a big challenge against us. The headwind of volunteers and funding is one that we struggle against, as will some of your churches. But the opportunity in front of us is to suffer for the gospel, to lay our lives down for King Jesus, and to inspire the people by the way we live our lives, to serve people in our communities and especially the poor. But if we miss the opportunity to speak up, to stand up and speak up, to center the voices of people with lived experience of poverty in how we speak truth to power, if we miss the opportunity to gather God's people around the problem of poverty and the need for there to be solutions found in community, which includes government but isn't restricted to government, then I think we'll have missed this coming opportunity. The church's witness at this time needs to include the prophetic call to those in power to remember the poor, just like in our own scriptures in Galatians, just like we're told to as church leaders. I think all those people that God sets in power, that he gives the power of the sword to, they will be called to give an account at the end for how they made choices. And one of the ways I think the Lord Jesus will judge them is against how did their policies, how did their actions affect those with the least resources to suffer. And so that's my general ramble. I've got a whole load of stats that I can share with you, but time may very well be against us. I can get there if you want. I've got some other stories about our service provision. In particular, the one that makes us realize where we're at the moment is 50% of our clients, after we give them debt advice, are still £250 a month in deficit. That is, after I've got them debt free, I can make their debts go away with insolvency. But after I've got them debt free, half of our clients are £250 a month short of what's needed for just the essentials in life. And so we know debt advice, important that it is, vital that it is, and life transforming and saving as it can very well be, on its own, it's not enough. We have to challenge the powers and principalities that say that £246 a month is enough to live on, that say that social security is something we need to be very careful that we don't spend too much money on. We don't want to build a dependency economy. You're like, no, but I also don't want people to die in their beds. I also don't want little boys to die of breathing difficulties in Manchester. I don't want little boys in Coventry, where I spent a lot of time growing up, dying through abuse because the state lacked the resources to intervene and care for him. So we've got some of these arguments in society to go against the fact that we've got 26 years of experience in delivering the service provision in partnership, proudly in partnership with the UK Church. And yet even our best effort can only get 50% of the people who come to us debt-free sustainably. We need livable incomes. We need stronger social security. We need a real living wage. We need society to resist the idea that, as for me and my house, we're okay, good luck to you. We need to resist the survival of the fittest trope. We need to resist the poverty's caused through choices. It is, but primarily poverty is caused through the choices of those in power to prefer people like them, and the choices we make every day as normal human beings to prefer people like me rather than people not like me. Poverty constrains people's options, from which they only really have poor choices available to them. I will share an email copy of statistics with Mark after this. I don't want to jeopardize the Wi-Fi connection by going looking, but I'm happy to take questions or whatever you want to do next, Mark.
Thank you, Gareth. It's great to get your perspectives and yeah, to be able to ask you some questions. I mean, just quickly, I mean, I guess you mentioned that even after getting people debt free, the people are still in deficit. Are you seeing the numbers of people coming to CAP increasing at the moment? And do you expect that to increase further into the new year?
So call volumes into CAP are about 40% up on this time last year, and that's a relatively steady number throughout the year. So we have been getting busier and busier. The number that's more frightening is a tripling of those. So it's the number of calls is up, but the nature of the calls has got worse. The nature of the calls is now increasingly crisis mode, survival mode. And so the number of people calling for emergency fuel vouchers, a voucher to put £49 on your prepayment meter to put the lights back on, to keep the fridge running, calls for those are up 300% on this time last year. So our call volumes are up a bit. Our crisis call volumes are a steep cliff. People needing food with empty fridges, empty cupboards, massively up. Any of you who are close to food banks and so on, you know just how busy they are right across the country. The model for our debt advice is very much around someone calls for help. We find out the circumstances, we connect them with the church, and in the next 2 to 6 weeks or so, the church connects with that person. But increasingly, we're needing to find ways to help people survive the wait from calling us to being able to meet a debt collector in a church. And that's quite terrifying. Our model used to work because social security used to be sufficient, and you just needed to fill the fridge and they'd be okay for a few weeks. But increasingly, if half of our clients are £250, typically £250 a light after we've got them debt free, then we've got to change the way the whole system works, not just how we do the debt advice.
Yeah, thanks, Gareth. I was speaking to a CEO of an academy of 4 big high schools in Bolton who said domestic abuse cases have shot up with parents at the school. So when you say crisis, yes, financial crisis is creating all sorts of problems with people's mental health and family situations. So yeah, it's something. So we've got a question here. What practical suggestions do you have as to what works and what doesn't work in helping those in poverty? Any thoughts, Gareth?
So at the national scale, one of the things that clearly doesn't work is the idea that people can't be trusted with money. So the household support fund, the £500 million at a time that government has put back into local authorities for people to claim if they meet certain criteria, what that tends to do is it builds the myth of the deserving and the undeserving poor, which in Jesus' name I reject. Human beings matter, whatever choices they've made to this point, and they all deserve to be able to eat and stay warm and sleep in a home. But also the extra bureaucracy that's put on that. You can have the money, but only as a voucher, and only if you can complete these forms, and only if you can complete them online. And the hurdles we put in place, understandably, because the state wants to prevent gaming and people taking advantage. But every step taken to make it harder to game is a step made harder for human beings to access who need the help. And so people stop trying. There are some local authorities in the country who are reporting that they've not been able to give all this money away. So clearly people didn't need it. Actually, no, the ability to get hold of the money was just so hard to navigate that if you didn't have the support of organisations like CAP or financial inclusion worker at a trust or food bank or something like that, you may struggle to access it. Breaking that down into the local, though, that does get trickier because you do have some mindsets to consider in local churches around if you start going towards a cash first way of helping people, what does that do around dependency on that community? Does that really help people break free from the cycles of poverty? That is a bit harder for me to narrate in a very short amount of time. And really, the state is one of the few organisations big enough to really insist on cash first approaches to solving poverty. What other things work? Understanding, I think the way that Trussell are beginning to increasingly fund debt advice and financial inclusion work along with the food bank parcels. When I was in Coventry, our big idea was, look, we can't stop people needing the food bank once, but in Jesus' name, we should be able to work out a way to prevent them needing them twice. And so let's find a way. But putting the help the other side of the crisis help, rather than in front, hey, while you're waiting, can I tell you about a thing? That just ignores how human beings are wired. Meeting the immediate need and coming in with some other support services afterwards begins to work with the grain of how the human brain and heart work rather than against it. They're my 2 very, very quick ones.
Yeah, that's great, Gareth. That ties into this other question about CAP's integration with some of the other services. You've just mentioned food banks. Is there a vision or a plan that CAP centres, I mean, we have 2 in Bolton where I am, are actually well integrated, or is that something that's still a work in progress?
It'll always be a work in progress because human beings are complicated and beautiful, aren't they? And so relationships between organisations rely on the strength of relationships between humans. And so in some parts of the country, Church Leader A and Council Leader B fell out 10 years ago, and so it's hard to make things work. My team, the relationship management team, one of our jobs is to broker at the national level the kind of partnerships that some local centres can participate in. So I look after the relationship with job centres, with the Department for Work and Pensions, and then we create the training materials for local centres to put into place where the debt centre can then partner with the local job centre plus to receive referrals both for jobs clubs and for debt advice. So that's one way that we try and make that work. In some parts of the country, the job centre doesn't want to know. In some parts of the country, the CAP centre doesn't need it because they've got enough people and they don't want to have a queue out the door. we absolutely promote partnership working. We celebrate in particular those local churches and local centres that make it work in their local area. The local debt centres and their area managers are the ones most in the know of agencies in the local area. There's no way that we at the national level can keep a database of everything. But as we work on our debt service transformation programme to increase the capacity of our debt service to help more people more effectively and lower the bar for partnership with local churches, one of the things that we are stepping into is the new world of technology does actually get us a bit closer to the ability to at least know what the opportunities are in local areas and begin to point local churches and local debt centres increasingly towards them. So we'll play a more active part in brokering those relationships as the years roll on.
Brilliant, brilliant. We've got a question from Steve from Corby just about the statistics that you mentioned. Does it include a list of life essentials, and is there a guide or range for each subject to different locations in the country? Could you?
So it's a brilliant question. We do have statistics about how many people fall short of enough of their essentials. What we don't have is a breakdown of exactly what those essentials are. Increasingly, I would point people towards the Joseph Brownsie Foundation and their work on minimum income standards as a really good reference stick for this. The minimum income standard is an idea that says, look, there's an amount of money that represents the ability for humans to meet their basic needs, which includes participating in their local community. So that would include things like not just school lunch for kids, but the ability for the kids to go on school trips, and that kind of thing. So it's a number that isn't the lower number that the government would use for the setting of universal credit and other subsistence level benefits. The much more dignified, healthy number that actually has had some focus group work on it by lots of communities from around the country to reflect on what society would agree is a tolerable amount of money. The real living wage is anchored to the minimum income standard numbers. So yeah, the real living wage is set at a level that would cover everybody's essentials and which includes, the level needed to participate in society in a healthy way.
Right, thank you, Gareth. Good. Well, I'd like us all to put our brains to work, really. We'd like to maybe just break us into 3 groups, Kay, perhaps. And we'd like to ask you the question, as people involved with church networks where you are, what is in our hands right now that, as churches, that can help us have greater impact together, working together as churches, and in partnership with our local authorities? So how can we make a greater impact in this area of money and poverty, particularly around helping people who are struggling with debt? How can we do a better, have a greater impact in our communities? How can we reach people better across our areas as a unity movement of churches, but also in partnership with our local authorities? So is that clear what the question is? We're going to give you about 10 minutes just to ponder that together, and then we'll bring us all back. So you should be able to join your groups now. See you in 10 minutes. Thanks for contributing to your groups. Do we just want to go around and reflect back what was said? So who was group 1? Anybody want to put their hand up for group 1? Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, I think one of the things we were picking up was this is all part of a big picture, and it's a big picture that's getting increasingly complex. So people who are being impacted with poverty are then also going to be likely to be impacted with mental health issues and other health issues. And we were just talking about some of the health initiatives that are happening in Wolverhampton, where they're looking at the bigger picture and going, health is impacted by these things. We need to be putting more provision in place. And I guess part of the challenge for us at this moment is things that have deteriorated to a point they haven't been at before. And therefore, we need to be thinking what some of the answers just as much as the public sector are, because they're struggling to come up with the answers.
Yeah. Thanks, Steve. Linda, can I pick on you?
Yep, you can do. I think a real sense of partly touching on the theology in terms of unity and working together, and that's obviously essential in terms of then your kind of output. So I think some genuine wrestling with working with different agencies. It was interesting in our group, we had someone involved in IT who's, has an interesting perspective in terms of linking up with businesses as well as churches and other agencies. So again, I think thinking how we do that, what's in our hands, also the Andy, I can't remember what it's called, but it's the warm space, isn't it?
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So basically, in terms of what's in our hands, it's making the most of the opportunities at the time, but also, with the opportunities, there come challenges as well, and so that place of unity and working together is really critical for what our output is. That's a brief summary on my end. Please feel free to add anyone else on the group.
Thanks, Linda. And in Ealing, do you have a network or a forum that allows church leaders in the broader sense to come together?
We do, yes.
Yeah.
So I mean, we've had our sort of unity movement in its existing form, because it certainly was around in a different guise before West London Leaders for the last 10 years. We have a strong core team. Throughout COVID, we gathered with different leaders at different times, but there is a good database. We probably cover about 120 churches. That sort of reduced in recent years, but we're making efforts now to be reaching out to more, and to be connecting afresh, because church leaders change, people move on. So we're not wanting to just sit back and rest on what we've done over the last 10 years, but really looking at a fresh vision for the 10 years going forward.
Brilliant, thank you. That's encouraging. Great vision there. So we had John, David and Colin in our group, and we talked about things that are going on. There is some effective hub work effectively in terms of food banks and supporting families. And churches are working well together with that, although I think there's a need for a stronger coordination of churches in that. And I think just this need for the role of an enabler, whether it's a person or a team, that actually that's really key to connecting these things together. We also talked about people who struggle to make use of services that are for them, perhaps because they are scared of putting their head above the parapet. And we can perhaps think of situations where we've seen that. I guess we recognise the need for practical action, but also advocacy, but perhaps less people are, it's a slower win advocacy very often, but very important. So how do we support that? And the work of prevention is perhaps underrated and weaker than it should be. And one of the suggestions was the specialization of churches, so that rather than us all trying to do the same thing, if we're coordinated, we're all doing different things, so that the overall body is more impactful. So those were our thoughts. Anybody else want to offer thoughts from their group or reflections?
I have run a franchise social action project and seen the development over the last 15 years, and I'm coming more and more to the conclusion that tends to put remembering the poor on the fringes of church. And I'd like to see a mindset and theology shift that moves remembering the poor away from the fringes and back to its apostolic function that was central to the early church. Mm-hmm. So a shift in mindset and theology that brings more of the church into the picture around these things, rather than it just being a few professional Good Samaritans.
Yeah. Thank you, Matt.
I'd agree with that. I think it's easy to discount responsibility by allocating it to a organization operating on behalf of the church. Mm-hmm. I express that perhaps slightly more strongly than I would do within this group than elsewhere.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. That's helpful. I mean, I think one of our group members talked about how politics at its worst creates an otherness out of the poor. They're not us, they're not the vote winners, they're not the money generators, and they become an other group, which is very dangerous. And so the church being very much, with the poor and alongside the poor, and a voice for the poor is perhaps even more important. I think we are coming to the end of our time together. Andy Frost, did you just want to make any last final comments before we wrap up with notices?
No, it's good, mate. Really great conversation, guys. Thank you for sharing. Really, there's lots of things there to think about, I think, isn't there? And not necessarily practical solutions to work into just yet, but lots of things to really wrestle with and to innovate around, I think. Yeah,
it's certainly another rallying call, isn't it? To gather church leaders in our local authority boundaries to start conversations if we're not having them already. So, thank you, everybody. Just some notices. You'll be aware that the Warm Welcome Spaces has really been a great success across the country. You can go to their website, warmwelcome.uk, and on their map, search the churches in your area that are offering Warm Welcome Spaces. And we're hopeful that actually, as churches do this to open up their spaces to the community, this might be the start of an ongoing further engagement, an increase of engagement with communities and with poverty. We have also been involved with family hubs, thinking about this government initiative to support families at this time. And if you'd like to know more about that, then do visit our website and our YouTube site, and you'll see resources around that and how to engage with churches and with local authorities. Also, just the invitation that we like to give out every month. If you would like or know anybody who would like a free one-to-one consultation, online or face-to-face, to explore borough-wide strategies, then do get in touch with us at the Gather Movement, and we'd be pleased to support you in that. Our next learning community will be on the 10th of January, and particularly excited to have Megan Blake from Sheffield University coming to speak to us. We'll also have another university expert, Diana Smith from Southampton University, and our focus is food deserts. And again, it's about access to people who are falling between the gaps in our communities. So we're going to get some sort of new thinking about this and what it means for churches. And I suspect, again, it will highlight the greater impact churches can make working together to reach people that currently are falling through the gap in food deserts. So do join us, and please do forward the invitations on to people that you know who are working in food security, as well as church leaders, so they can come and engage with this really high level input from some experts in our country around food security and food deserts.